this bizarre incident that happened at a Polish police headquarters where as I understand it, the commander of all the Polish police was nearly killed by some Ukrainian device that exploded in his headquarters.
Well, I can only tell you what I read in the article that was sent to me from Poland, that 2 grenade launchers were altered, I guess. One was supposed to be used for a speaker on some sort of stereo system. I don't know what the other one was for, but they were given as gifts by a Ukrainian chief of police to the Polish chief of police with the hope of cultivating closer ties and cooperation. Somewhere along the line, the Ukrainians seem to think it happened after they sent it off to him, and that may well be true. I have no idea. A live grenade was found in this thing, and it accidentally or purposely exploded. We don't know, but it's a very hard to imagine how something like this could have crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland without being detected. I'm sure the Polish chief of police wasn't hiding anything. You know, the sad part here is that you're well aware, as many of us are, that there's this long history of antagonism between the Poles and the Ukrainians. So this opens up that whole ugly chapter for discussion. Was this intentional, or was this in fact an accident? Nobody is able to answer it, except that right now the facts are what I sent to you on email, and that's all we know.
What were the injuries to the Polish commander?
Apparently none. He had maybe modest scratches or something, but no serious injuries of any kind were reported.
Okay. Do we still have a president of Poland beating the drum and acting as if his troops are going to get engaged?
Yes. Well, in the op-ed that I just finished that the American Conservative will have out tomorrow, I lead with the remarks of the Deputy Polish Minister of Defense, who is warning an audience on the 29th of November that this war is growing in intensity and Poland is likely to be involved in it, and hints at potential mobilization and a number of other things down the line. Now, since then, we've also had a source tell us that the Polish government is now looking at 200,000 troops that could be mobilized next year. All of this is disconcerting because, remember, inside the NATO alliance, Poland is really alone in its enthusiasm for aggressive war against Russia. Nobody else, with the possible exception of the Romanians, is interested.
Well, your piece is a scary one, Colonel. I mean, you start by summarizing the interview. We talked about this before, but we'll touch on it again. That General Zaluzhny had with The Economist magazine, and when he asks for 300 new tanks and 600 to 700 new infantry fighting vehicles and 500 new howitzers, you conclude he's not asking for assistance. He's asking for a new army. And he must know that this is not possible.
Well, one would think so. And I think they were trying to set the stage for a meeting with the United States in which they would get more other types of assistance, potentially convince us and maybe others in this so-called coalition of the willing to intervene and help them in some way. That's why I find it extremely disturbing, because President Biden has said from the beginning that we were not going to directly engage the Russians in a military confrontation. Yet we seem to be moving closer to that outcome. And the Poles, of course, I think would actually welcome that, which is very dangerous. You know, this is a problem when you ally yourself with a relatively small state. The small state has a permanent interest in leveraging your power for their benefit.
Right. You point out that Ukraine hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity, and Ukraine with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers. How many healthy soldiers do they have remaining? Do you know?
The last word that I had was they had 194,000 quote unquote effectives. And in the article, Zaluzhny mentions that he's got 200,000 combat ready troops, people that can fight. He has another 500,000 people in uniform, but they're not necessarily soldiers. They may be police, paramilitary, other kinds of functionaries, but they're not fit for frontline duty. And I think that's a huge admission, because it also tells you something about the enormous number of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking.
Why is General Zaluzhny saying all this in public? Is there some purpose or goal to this?
Yeah, I think, again, he and President Zelensky know what I know and know what anybody knows who looks carefully at the assembling Russian force and its enormous firepower, standoff attack and direct firepower. And he's being honest. He's saying, well, their attacks could be stronger than we think, and we could be weaker than we thought later on in the article. In other words, it's a backhanded way of saying, look, this is very dangerous. We probably are not going to succeed against this kind of force. We've asked you for more. What are you going to do? In other words, the ball is in your court, Washington. And after all, we urged them to fight from the beginning. We've never come back and said, well, there's a point at which it makes no sense to fight on.
Would it be fair to characterize General Zaluzhny as the realist and President Zelensky as sort of has pipe dreams? And would it be fair to say that the Russians have far more respect for the general than they do for the president?
Well, first of all, I have no idea, but I suspect that Zaluzhny, who's been on the phone before with his counterpart in Moscow, has at least a rapport with the Russians. What that is and how well that goes, I can't evaluate, but they have talked. And I think Zaluzhny is being realistic and as open as he can. And Zelensky is permanently cheerleader for the war in perpetuity and has sold himself as Washington's man on the ground to lead the charge against Moscow. I don't think he can back down from that. He's made so many sweeping statements that are so ridiculous that he can't retreat.
Is it conceivable that General Zaluzhny would work out some peace agreement with the Russians in order to save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, no matter what President Zelensky thinks about it, pushing him out of the way? He's got the pipeline to Moscow. Nobody in Moscow will say a word to President Zelensky.
Judge, we're now in the realm that I would comfortably call the Twilight Zone.
All right.
Who knows? I mean, we could sit here and speculate about that, but I think there are lots of people that are willing to pull out their weapons and shoot people down right now inside Kiev in the government who might go that route. I think that they're stuck. They're going to fight. And perhaps in the midst of this fighting, there will be a call for some sort of ceasefire. And again, the problem is you're dealing now with a Russian government that has given up on the West.
Let's move from the East all the way to the West. Does General Zaluzhny have respect at the Pentagon? Does he have the ear of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, or of Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin, somebody who can get to the president on the phone in a few minutes?
I'm sure that he probably has a line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and potentially the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And remember, we've been down this road before with Milley. He leaked his rejected advice to the president to the New York Times when he said Ukrainians have done about as much as they can and they should negotiate. And that was rejected. And he was sent back out to recant and effectively sing the tune of inevitable Ukrainian victory. So at this point in time, even if he has a direct line, the man in charge is sitting in the White House. And I'm sure that no one in this administration at this stage wants to admit that they made a terrible mistake and put Ukraine's very existence at risk. Your
Greatest fear, and stop me if I don't have this right, is that the man in the White House will pull an LBJ. And when his generals, when Westmoreland said to LBJ, we're going to lose unless we don't have another 125,000 troops, LBJ said, you got them. I don't know that Zaluzhny would say that to Biden, but what's to prevent Biden from saying, I'm using your language, Colonel, you wrote this. It's brilliant. By the way, for those listening to us, it's called Downfall in Kyiv and Washington, Colonel Douglas McGregor. Colonel, your fear is that Joe Biden wants to lead a coalition of the willing, which is to be about 2 or 3 NATO countries.
Yes, I think that the people in Washington, and when I say people, I'm talking about virtually everybody inside the Beltway, has all drunk heavily from the Kool-Aid that says Russia is weak, Russia is incompetent, The soldiers are no good. The army is weak. We can prevail. We have to stay the course with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can still outfight them. And if we need to go in to bolster the Ukrainians and try to establish, under the guise of a no-fly zone on the ground, some sort of secure area in western Ukraine, down near the Polish border, in order to provide a safe haven for retreating Ukrainian forces or refugees or something else, we should do that, because we can still dominate the Russians if we need to. And that was, see, LBJ knew that he had enormous leverage with the United States Navy and Air Force, not just our ground forces over North Vietnam. We have no such leverage over the Russians. This is a pure continental land combat, and they hold all the trump cards. And we have very few forces, and we're depending very heavily, if we go in there, on the Poles. And while the Poles are very brave, courageous soldiers, that's an irrational act on the part of an American.
I mean, what coalition would there be? Who besides Poland and Romania would be in Joe Biden's army, and America, of course?
Well, I'm sure you'd have some British Special Operations Forces. Beyond that, who knows? I mean, the rest of NATO really doesn't have much to send. I mean, the force that was described in the interview that Zaluzhny asked for is larger than any of the armies in Europe. So what are they going to send? And the answer is, I don't think they have much to send at all. And now they've already exhausted most of their supplies of ammunition and weapons. They've sent most of that excess that's either now in Russian hands, and some of it is still with the Ukrainians. But the Russians have captured a lot of equipment, destroyed a lot of equipment.
One of our regular guests is an American named Matthew Van Dyke. Matt is the head of Sons of Liberty International, which he describes as all ex-military. These guys are young. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s, who believe in the Ukrainian cause, who wear military fatigues, who are physically present on the ground. I don't know if they carry weapons. They don't shoot. They're not close to where people are shooting or being shot at. They're training Ukrainians. Matt sent out a rather startling tweet just a few minutes ago. Here it is. Ukraine must conduct a major offensive now. Ukraine has the advantage this winter in morale and logistics. Russia will recover by spring and will never be this weak again. The next 2 months are critical in this war. Don't dig in, advance. Now, I don't know if you know this fellow. He's a young man. He's on with us regularly. This is the first time I've heard him say anything like this. Russia will recover by spring. What do you think about this?
It sounds to me like some of the ideas that were hatched by Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944 for offensives in the East, when there was no capability whatsoever for offensive action in the German army. Sounds to me like his thinking behind the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army couldn't fuel itself 100 kilometers without falling apart. So I think, I don't think, I'm sure the man is very sincere and believes in what he's saying, but I think he's dead wrong. And there's not a whole lot for the Russians to do between now and the end of January for them to be ready. I think they're very close to it.
I want to go back to General Zaluzhny before I ask you about President Putin in Belarus. I want to make sure I understand the numbers. General Zaluzhny has about 190,000 troops, and then he has 200,000 trained troops and reserves. So if he wants, he has about 400,000 troops. Do I have those numbers right?
Well, he actually gave, and again, I don't know that these numbers are trustworthy. Much of what comes out of Kyiv has never been trustworthy. So take it with a grain of salt. Okay,
but it's Zaluzhny who has a reputation for being truthful, no?
No. None of the Ukrainians have been truthful about the conduct of this war. They've lied prolifically about everything. And he's saying they have 700,000, 200,000 in that category of fit to fight, trained combat troops, and then 500,000 of others, police, paramilitary. And so forth. Now, again, I have no idea what's going on. I do know that the Nazi enforcers are brutalizing people, forcing them into uniform, sending them to the front.
These are Ukrainian Nazi enforcers forcing young men, able-bodied or not, into Ukrainian military uniforms.
Yeah, they're sending press gangs through Kiev and other cities at nightclubs, night spots, to see if they can find young men who may be there and then pressing them into service. Sort of what the Royal Navy did in the 19th century and the 18th century to keep the ships filled. So that's why I say I'm sure that Matt's a sincere, and I do know that if you ask Ukrainian soldiers, they do speak very confidently of their future as though they have a chance to really win. And you heard that from German soldiers right up until March of 1945.
Oof.
So I don't think that we should take that very seriously.
I would imagine that President Zelensky's people are regressively controlling the media and what the Ukrainian troops and what their families back home hear.
Well, I'm sure they are too, but he doesn't have to work too hard to control the Western media. That's already in his camp.
Already. All right, back to numbers available. What does President Putin have available? Is it 300,000 that are about to add to the fighting force that's there now?
No, the numbers once again that were given were misleading. He said, well, he has 200,000 fresh combat troops, probably more than that. You know, I said a few weeks ago that the numbers by January could go up to 700,000.
Russian numbers.
Russian numbers. And you just divide that roughly in half because about half of that falls into logistics and standoff attack and fire support. The rest of it are attacking forces that go in on the ground to kill the enemy. So I think the Russians are, quite frankly, already outnumber their opponents dramatically. And they have been training very, very hard. Now, you have to add to that number probably 75,000 Belarusian troops. And Putin, of course, is up in Belarus right now.
Right. Now, what is he doing in Belarus?
Belarus is going to provide whatever is required or necessary for the Russian forces in their country to launch attacks against Ukraine. As I said, there's 75,000 in that army, and most of that is deployed along the border with Lithuania and Poland. But they have a secure base of support in Belarus for at least 150,000 troops attacking north to south.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of the most as I listen to you and our friend Scott Ritter, and as I read the media available to me, is that the president of Poland is crazy. And he's very, very anxious to begin a conflagration that historians will one day call World War III.
Well, that's again going back to the discussion earlier about a small state ultimately leveraging a large one.
Will pressure be put on Joe Biden, whether it's from the Pentagon or the globalists, to back Poland up?
Oh, I think that that's very much in people's minds right now, that Poland is the springboard against Russia, and that we should be prepared to use that in order to rescue Ukraine from inevitable destruction. That's why I wrote the article, because I'm afraid that we'll suddenly hear from Joe Biden on the television. Tonight, my fellow Americans, I've directed our forces to advance into Western Ukraine to provide a safe haven or something, a secure zone in Western Ukraine. And it's about peace, democracy, and freedom, all of which has got nothing to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what we said about Vietnam. You're not talking about Vietnam, you're talking about Russia, a great power.
If he does that, the Congress will do nothing. The president of the United States can't start a war on his own. I'm familiar with the War Powers Resolution. I think it's unconstitutional, but it is the law. But this will fall right into the hands of the globalists. We know their goal to remove President Putin from power, whether by embarrassment and humiliation or death.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that people understand the meaning of what I've said in that op-ed. That whatever is said to justify a potential intervention by us in the western part of Ukraine should be dismissed out of hand as dangerous nonsense. The opportunity to do things differently ended a long time ago. If people were serious about trying to prevent the Russians from moving into Ukraine or deterring them from going any further than a few kilometers, we had that back in February, March, and April. We could have sent vast forces over there very, very quickly. Well, of course we didn't. And Judge, we didn't do it because they're not ready. And we don't have ready forces now for a stand-up war in Eastern Europe. So this is all dangerous nonsense.
Where is General Milley on this? I mean, what General Milley leaked was a truthful analysis of the situation. Then they made him do the mea culpa. So when that happens, I mean, the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they must know that Milley is a realist. They can get him to mouth their words, but when they ask for his advice, I assume he's telling them what he truly thinks we should do, which is to get the hell out.
Well, on this occasion, I think he has told them the truth behind closed doors, that we should not involve ourselves in this. It's too risky. We don't have the forces for it. We don't have the logistical infrastructure. We don't have the ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. But he's not someone who is noted throughout his career for standing up for much of anything.
Do we have 4 stars in Europe right now?
Yes, you have a 4-star at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
And who's in charge of the 40,000 American troops in Poland?
Well, I don't know. That could be the 5th Corps commander. The 5th Corps has a headquarters over there right now from Fort Hood, potentially. I don't know what the exact command relationships are, but you've got 3 stars, you've got a 4-star, and then you have several 2-stars. Really very top heavy for a force that's only about 45,000 troops.
Were those 45,000 trained, ready, and prepared to march? God forbid, I'm even saying this, to march east?
Well, I think they're prepared to defend the Polish border. I don't think they're prepared to advance into Western Ukraine and confront an enemy like the Russians. But again, I hold the minority opinion. Remember, I told you at the beginning, you go into Washington and everybody's, oh, these Russians are terrible. Look at them. They got all this wrong and that wrong.
In Washington, you and I are considered lunatics.
Yeah, we're the lunatics because we're worried about a real war breaking out and not being able to fight it. You should never even consider going to war unless you're reasonably confident that the terms of battle favor you and that you have a damn good chance of winning it. Why else would you go? This is not one of those occasions. And the Europeans are watching all of this. The only thing we can successfully do in a very short period of time is persuade most Europeans that we've lost our minds and that we're a dangerous partner. We may well see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization go out of existence very rapidly, de facto, as a result of this kind of behavior. All the things that we said we were fighting to preserve will go away.
President Zelensky visited the United States. We have 2 short clips of him with President Biden. President Biden does the speaking, but I want your thoughts on this.
The American people have been with you every step of the way, and we will stay with you. We will stay with you for as long as it takes. He continues to be wrong. The sooner he makes it clear that he cannot possibly win this war, that's when the time we have to put this president in a position to be able to decide how he wants the war to end.
Now, why does the president of the United States say things like that when he must know that they can't be true?
Well, he also subsequently said, we will stay with Ukraine as long as it is there.
Wow. That sounds more like the president of Poland than the president of Ukraine. We'll get to the vice minister of Poland in a minute. You wrote a piece about him. Yeah. But is the president receiving truthful intel, or is this just for Ukrainian consumption that he made this statement standing next to President Zelensky?
No, I think it's for the consumption of the collective West. Remember, this narrative cannot be dropped. It cannot be abandoned until it's unambiguously destroyed. And that narrative says Ukraine is winning and Ukraine is going to win. And anything that deviates from that line is unacceptable. Remember, he's asking for billions and billions, 45 billion in addition to the defense budget, which is 858 billion. And how do you do that unless you insist that your client state that's fighting this proxy war for you is not only winning, but can win and will win?
The numbers, Colonel, are staggering. In the original appropriation for Ukraine, there were 2 of them. It came to 65 billion. President Biden asked for another 37 billion. The Congress gave him 45 billion. So we're up to 110 billion. Now that 45 billion is part of the 1.7 trillion. Like I said, the numbers are confusing, which the House passed. So it seems as though all this is going to make its way there. either in hardware or in cash. And as we know, over the objections of Senator Paul in the Senate and Congressman Massey in the House, mutual friends of yours and mine, who offered amendments to have an inspector general certify that this is what we sent and this is where the cash is going and this is where the armaments are going. No inspector general, no American to receive the stuff whatsoever. I did learn, I don't know if it was from you or elsewhere, that it can take up to 100 crew members to operate a Patriot missile system. Is that true? And if so, how do we train that number of Ukrainians to operate this very expensive hardware?
Well, the answer is yes. And let me just go back and revisit the money one more time, because people need to understand that what we're doing is moving money from one pocket to another as far as the taxpayer is concerned. We're taking money from the Treasury and essentially divesting ourselves of it through the Department of Defense, moving it over to the defense industries and their constituents. And subsequently, money flows back to the Congress as a matter of gratitude for the enormous wealth transfer. So it's wrong to think of all this money showing up. Secondly, when you start talking about the equipment, much of this equipment may never get there. Much depends on how much longer Ukraine lasts. And as we'll discuss in this hour, in this 30 minutes or so, I'll point out I'm not sure they're going to be around long enough to absorb and assimilate anything. Now, as far as Patriot goes, it's one battery, presumably 8 launchers, 128 missiles per launcher, and about 93 men in the battery, probably a few more because we're ostensibly supposed to train people. But frankly, if we try to train people, it'll be 3 to 4 to 5 months before this thing ever gets into action. I suspect we'll end up with contractors, U.S. soldiers and, retired or former operating as contractors, making this equipment work. It's only point defense. You can protect portions of things, a portion of Kyiv or key military installations, but it's not going to have any significant impact on the battle once it arrives anyway.
You wrote recently about the Vice Minister of Defense. I think I have the title.
Deputy Minister of Defense, right.
Of Poland.
Right.
Who sounds as antagonistic as the president of Poland and as promoting war as the president of Poland. What did he say, and how do you analyze it?
Well, his statement was to an audience, a mixed audience, not military, but civilians as well as military. Simply said, this war is growing more and more intense, and with each passing day, we are more likely to be involved in it. And we are now going to adopt measures to prepare ourselves effectively for the eventuality that we may be involved. And then subsequently, there was some discussion of mobilizing 200,000 Polish reserve soldiers. Now, when that's going to happen, I don't know. Somebody mentioned recently that it may already be underway. I don't know. It could be. I thought it would happen after the new year.
Colonel, are there elements in the American globalist establishment? All right, I got to define the term. The State Department, their buddies in Europe, members of Congress, the West Wing, that want the United States in a hot war, soldier to soldier, against Russia?
I would hesitate to say yes, but you can't say no. So let me try to explain what I'm talking about.
All right. And throw in the name of, this is to raise your blood pressure, Colonel, no matter how much I love you, Senator Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham. Well, first of all, let's understand that I don't think anybody in their right mind wants a direct military confrontation with Russia. The problem is that we in the West do not see Russia as Russia is. We see it through this distorting lens. We either impute to it Soviet-like attributes or evil attributes, whatever you want to call it. We tend to view it through the lens of our own notion of economic power and wealth. And you reach utterly false assumptions about Russia. Assumption number one, Russia is really weak. Russia can't stay the course. All we have to do is double down and we'll attrit them. We'll wear them out. No, it's the exact opposite. That's an impossibility, as they've demonstrated already economically. Secondly, their military is no good. It's no good because when they came in, they were soft. They didn't come in hard. They didn't do very well. They seem to have been defeated, all of which is erroneous nonsense, completely misunderstands what Putin was about, what the Russians were trying to achieve. So they believe in their heart of hearts that if we were to show up on the battlefield in Western Ukraine, cross the Polish border with Polish allies, maybe some Romanian forces too, that the Russians would be so intimidated and so afraid that they would immediately say, stop, let's stop, please don't come into this. And they're wrong. They're very wrong. In fact, there's a real appetite in Russia, to be perfectly blunt with you, to do real damage to our forces if they get the opportunity. So I think you've got a misapprehension of the danger and the level of response that it will elicit. And now we have a much larger, very different Russian army in the field. This is now a wartime theater. Ukraine is no longer being treated with kid gloves. Initially, they said, no, the Ukrainians are our brother Slavs. We don't want to harm Ukrainians. We don't want to do damage to infrastructure. We want to get along so that we can build a new peace. That's gone. The Russians now have decided there is no way to negotiate an end to this. No one will negotiate in good faith. Therefore, we must crush the enemy. That's what's coming.
Let me play for you what your former colleague, General David Petraeus, said about Putin's miscalculation, about his ability only to go so far as what is domestically palatable, his phrase, and about, I think you'll really take issue with this, the absence of training or the poor training of the Russian military.
He has obviously completely miscalculated from the very beginning. He has reacted as Ukraine has seized the strategic initiative as it launched counteroffensives, first won the battles of Kyiv and other northern cities, of Kharkiv, retook part of the area that is to the west of the Dnipro River down in the south, and launched a very impressive counteroffensive in the east. He's tried everything he can that would be domestically palatable to mobilize additional forces. It's not going well. They aren't training and equipping them adequately at all.
That was from my friend and former colleague Neil Cavuto at Fox News, his program 2 days ago. Colonel.
Well, the kindest thing I can say is that Dave Petraeus is largely divorced from reality. And once again, David Petraeus has embraced this fictional narrative along the lines that I described before. And that's part of what he's going to do, because he is a product of the very people that are trying to push us into war with Russia now, that pushed us into Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, not just to defeat the enemy, not just to remove the regime, but to stay and occupy and transform. And he was in the forefront of all of that. So I think he's just sort of punching his ticket as a member of the in club with the status quo. And that's the status quo that's ruling us in Washington. They are largely divorced from reality. The Russian forces are not poorly trained. They're very well trained. And as I think I mentioned before, I've watched several films that were made available to me through various sources in Europe. I was very impressed with the way the Russians operated. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have taken such horrendous losses. They now admit to 35,000 missing. They admit to more than 100,000 killed. You start adding up the numbers, so you're looking at 150,000 plus who are dead. Now they're trying to force teenage boys at the age of 13, 14, 15 into uniform. They're now telling the disabled that you're going to be mobilized. They're literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. And these are hundreds of thousands of untrained people. The very thing that Petraeus is accusing the Russians of absolutely fits the description of the Ukrainian force arrayed against the Russians.
Let me show you, play you another clip, also from Fox News, of General Petraeus saying things like, Russia cannot outsuffer the United States and Ukraine and Europe because Russia has suffered more casualties in 10 months in Ukraine than in 9 years in Afghanistan.
He's in a very difficult position. I don't think he is yet willing to acknowledge that Russia cannot outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans, which I think he still believes is possible. But I think there is going to come a point, and we need to hasten that moment, when he realizes that this war is not just unsustainable because of the terrible losses on the battlefield, which are now many times what they sustained in over 9 years in Afghanistan, just in the first 10 months of this war, but also the damage that's being done to their economy, their financial system, his personal confidants, the sanctions against them, and the export controls that are bringing their industry to their knees.
Bringing their industry to their knees. I don't know where he could get that from.
Oh, I think he's just reading from the script that is disseminated widely in Washington. He and Lindsey Graham and a whole range of people in Washington just keep repeating this stuff as though it were true, and it's not. And we know that Russian industry is by no means on its knees. Quite the contrary, it's booming. And they're exporting more oil and gas than they ever have. They're swimming in cash. That's completely wrong. The Russian population, if anything, is far more exuberant and enthusiastic about this war than I think Putin privately would like. He's acted to restrain some of the more radical nationalist elements that would like to go in and do the equivalent of wiping Ukraine off the map. And of course, that's something that Putin thinks is ridiculous and has no intention of doing.
What kind of casualty numbers have the Russians suffered? And is General Petraeus comparing apples to oranges when he compares, an intense street by street urban warfare in Ukraine with trying to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Well, no, that is apples and oranges. And there's something else worth mentioning, that after the initial entry into Afghanistan, the Russian dominated forces that had gone in there to begin with were largely withdrawn. They relied very heavily on reservists from neighboring Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and other Central Asian republics, as they were called. Now they're independent countries. And of course, they were not terribly excited about being there. And they didn't do very much, to be quite frank. So it's a very different war, the one you're describing. This is existential for the Russians. There's nothing existential about Afghanistan.
How bad or what's the category? What are the numbers, if you know them, of Russian casualties? You opined earlier, educated opining, that Ukraine may have 125 to 150,000 dead. How many Russians are dead as a result of the entry of the military into Ukraine?
I'm told somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 at the most, maybe 35,000, and an equal number of wounded. But bear in mind, the Russians have set up a very elaborate medical support structure, and they've gotten very good at evacuating the wounded. So their wounded have survived much more successfully than the Ukrainian wounded. So that's about right if you look at it from a 1 to 5 perspective, which is pretty much the standard right now. Of course, at this point in time, they've been killing Ukrainians, 8 Ukrainians for every 1 Russian, or 10 Ukrainians for every 1 Russian. Bakhmut has turned into a particularly terrible Ukrainian bloodbath, and hugely beneficial to the Russians.
From your experience as a tank commander, winter is here. The earth is frozen solid in Ukraine. Who does this help, the Ukrainians or the Russians?
Well, actually, it's not frozen throughout Ukraine. Right now, during the day in southern Ukraine, this is down near Odessa, Kherson, it rises to about 34 degrees during the day and drops down to about 20 at night. So you still have standing water in those trenches. So the South is not ready to support large quantities of tracked or wheeled vehicles. The North is absolutely frozen solid, but it looks more and more as though the Russians would like to complete their task in Donbass first. They want to eliminate all the Ukrainian forces that are in Donbass.
So who gains by frozen ground?
The Russians, immediately. That is very much in to their advantage. Nobody likes fighting in the mud. I mean, right. The mud is ugly for both sides, but the mud makes it harder for a swift offensive than it would be if it were frozen.
How do the Russians move? They don't move on foot. Do they move in tanks? Do they move in trucks? Do they move in trains? How do the troops get from the Russian-Ukrainian border into the inner parts where the fighting is?
Well, they go a certain distance in tracked or wheeled vehicles, but most of the fighting that you see happening along the line of contact, which is about 400 miles, is actually on foot. And it's very grueling, very demanding physically, very slow and incremental. But remember, this was always an economy of force measure. It was designed to grind up as many Ukrainians as possible at the lowest possible cost to the Russians. That's what's been going on in southern Ukraine. It continues. It's worked brilliantly. And Surovikin, the theater commander, has said that continues until he's ready to launch his offensives. When the offensives are launched, it will be a very different battle. But the interesting part is that the Ukrainians have taken so many casualties in the south, we're beginning to hear reports that they're on the verge of collapse. And that's why we're hearing about teenage boys age 13, 14, 15 pressed into service, the disabled. And we're getting videos that are coming in now from Ukrainian soldiers. They disappear almost as quickly as they appear naturally, where some of the Ukrainian soldiers are saying, well, the people in Kyiv better be hopeful that the Russians get to them before we do, because the Russians will probably put them in jail. If we get to them, we'll kill them.
Ukrainian soldiers talking about the people back home?
Yes. Talking about the people in the government.
Oh.
Because they see Zelensky's government as largely remote from them. They see no evidence that anybody gives a damn about them. They're running out of food. They don't have proper clothing. They're freezing. They're taking heavy casualties.
Did President Zelensky do himself any good with that speech to a joint session of Congress 2 nights ago?
I don't think Zelensky was talking to anybody in Ukraine. I think he was basically talking to the collective West, and he spun the narrative. I think behind the scenes, he was very, very blunt. I mean, he came close to it a couple of times in his speech when he said, "You've given us a lot, but it's not enough." And you go back to that interview that was conducted by The Economist.
Right.
You listen to Zelensky, read that interview, read what Zaluzhny, the general, says. These people are at the end of their tether. And they told the people at the CIA, they told the people in the Pentagon, they told the people in the White House, if you don't come in and rescue us, we are going to be annihilated. We are not going to withstand what is coming. They're not fools. They know what's coming. We have satellite coverage. We've shown them the pictures. They know what kind of force is going to attack.
Last area of our inquiry, President Putin, just about 72 hours ago, made some interesting statements. I'd love your take on them, Colonel. Here's President Putin. Our goal is not to spin the flywheel of military conflict, but on the contrary, to end this war. We will strive for an end to this, and the sooner, the better, of course. And again, all armed conflicts end one way or another with some kind of negotiations on the diplomatic track. Sooner or later, any parties in a state of conflict sit down and make an agreement. The sooner this realization comes to those who oppose us, the better. We have never given up on this. Is he sending the West a message?
I think he's sending the West a message. He's also telling the Ukrainians quite clearly that what he will launch, when he finally launches it, sometime in January, early February at the latest, is a war-winning offensive. In other words, this is designed to terminate the conflict. He understands the longer that this lasts, the greater the danger of unwanted confrontation between us and him. He's very sensitive to that. He's not a fool. He doesn't want that. We shouldn't want it either. And then he's also saying, even when this happens and I launch these offensives and I crush the enemy, when the enemy surfaces and said, we've had enough, he will talk to them and he will negotiate an end to this. We are the ones that keep saying no negotiation. We're the ones that say unconditional surrender to you, Mr. Putin. That was effectively Lindsey Graham's comment. Mr. Putin, unless you go out in the middle of Red Square and shoot yourself through the head and commit suicide, there can be no negotiated settlement. This is absurd.
Is anybody whispering? Into Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Ron Klain, Joe Biden's ear? It's time to sit down and talk?
Well, just remember, he channeled deliberately. I mean, I assume that Bob Kagan somebody like that wrote the speech for Zelensky because he channeled the neocon hero FDR.
Yeah.
What very few people understand is when FDR demanded unconditional surrender in Tehran, Stalin told him, "Why did you do that? This has made this war much worse than it would have been. We wanted people to give up so that we can end this war and stop losing people. You've made this war last longer." And FDR just sat there and looked at him like,
Right.
That's what we're doing. We are prolonging this war.